Hello, welcome to Brown Girl Book Lover. I am Leslie Ann Murray, and today we are talking to Dickson Lam about his book, Paper Sons. And I'm really happy because Dickson and I went to graduate school together. We did our MFA at Rutgers University, and so it was nice when I was reading this book. I saw parts of it that I read in graduate school. So, thank you, Dickson, and welcome to Brown Girl Book Lover.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll get started. If you can just tell us a quick summary of your book.
Sure. Paper Sons, it's a memoir, so it's autobiographical, obviously. But I'm writing about my life growing up in San Francisco, my sort of journey. It's part coming of age story. The main thing that sort of centers the book is my relationship with my father. It also deals about dealing with coming from immigrant family, coming from a family, an abusive family. It also deals with my growth as a teenager in San Francisco, being a graffiti writer. And it's a part of why I wanted to write the book also was about wanting to write about a San Francisco that doesn't really exist anymore.
Which is true, and it was nice reading that because I came here when I was 18, and reading about the book, I could remember like the San Francisco when I came here I was 18, so I was a little bit nostalgic for it. You're writing about some really heavy personal and family issues in your book. It's internalized racism, sexual abuse, paternal abandonment, and infidelity. Can you tell me, how did you allow yourself to tell these stories out in the open?
Yeah, I just pretended my family doesn't read.
Yeah.
So I just would always say, when people say, "Oh, how can you write this stuff about your family?" I'm like, they don't read. They're not going to read this. And I think that was very useful. It was a very useful guide as I was writing. But now that the book's published, I realized, oh, actually people do read this. And I'm like, oh man, So I think as I was writing, I gave myself permission to allow myself to believe that other people wouldn't be reading it. So that helped me a little bit. I think when you're starting off with your first book, it would be different. I think if let's say I wrote a novel and I had developed a following, and then I'm writing a memoir, then I would be, I think, more conscious and aware of the reader. But I think it's when it's your first book, you haven't gone through the process yet of having your book published and having to do interviews and talk about your work. So it didn't really feel real yet.
Yeah.
So that was great for me.
So, but what happened when people read it and your family read it?
Yeah.
Was there a backlash?
No, there wasn't a backlash,
Yeah.
and I was really surprised by, I really believed that people in my family wouldn't read it at all, and I just assumed. But I was very surprised that actually, some family that I wasn't that close to actually read it. Like they felt very proud that I was an author. They were like, "Oh wow, you wrote this book. I really want, I want to read it." And I was like, "Oh, they read this stuff," and I felt very uncomfortable all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Because this is family that I see during certain holiday events and whatnot, and now that they know more about my family, I think it puts some things into context for them for why our family is the way it is.
In the book, I love the portrayal of your sister, and even when I was reading it in grad school, I love your portrayal of your sister. She's very reserved, but she has this very dignified strength in the book, and I like reading that. And I wanted to talk about the idea, you just talked about it, about the representation of Asian Americans. And in some ways, does Paper Sons challenge some common stereotypes of Asian Americans?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much it feels like everything. In terms of my sister, the idea of, the passive Asian American woman. There's the scene of her, the knives, and that was something I was, conscious of trying to highlight certain things. So I always felt like there was a disconnect between what I see on TV versus, what I experience. And for myself, I think, I don't see stories about, Asian American graffiti writers, and usually when I see things on TV about Asian American kids, right? It's usually like, these kids are nerds or doing well in school and that kind of story. But I wanted the story to reflect my experience, which was like, not everybody has that experience.
But we need, I do understand the call for complicated stories because we need complicated stories.
Right.
Just to understand like our complicated history and our identities. It's not just, just one singular identity. And we need complicated story structures. Our indictee Roy was talking about the importance of having a story be wild, right? And we shouldn't, because so many stories are just packaged really nicely and neatly to sell and for people to consume, but their stories need to be wild, maintain that sense of wildness. And there are two things when I'm thinking about that in terms of your your memoir structure. There's a sense of wildness because it's non-linear. You move into history and the personal stories and the short story structure within it, right? So it's not like starts from A to B. There's short, tight stories within it. And why did you choose to structure your novel that way?
I think the structure kind of, I didn't really like think through all the different structures and say, I like that structure, I'm doing that. It was more like, oh, this is what I have. I think this structure would fit this. And then once I understood that, then I started shaping in the ways you're talking about. So originally when I wrote it very more traditionally. I had a point A, and I kind of worked my way through it. And I wrote all these pieces, but it didn't work as a story. Because I think when you're doing memoir versus a novel, in a novel, to make things connect, you could kill a character here, you could make this thing happen. But a memoir, like, that didn't really happen. So how do I get from here to here? So you have to do these things that aren't necessarily the best in terms of making a compelling story, but you're trying to fit things in a certain way. But what I found is when I had all these pieces, like, oh, this part is really compelling, this part's really compelling, this in-between stuff is really unnecessary. So I started trying to reorganize it based on theme instead of plot. And once I kind of really got into that, I stopped worrying about making things connect, and I just tried to find these like nuggets and throw them up on post-its and throw them up the wall and try to figure out how could I sort of organize it. And then I started realizing that this sort of structure fits better with what I'm trying to tell. Things you're speaking about in terms of how we, like my idea of like time, like this idea of time being more circular and not sort of like, oh, I left that behind, now I'm somewhere else. So that's why I wanted the book to kind of move like that, to kind of go from this point to that point, but kind of keep coming back around, but looking at it from a different angle, because that's how I experience life, in that what we experience this day. Sometimes we have these moments where we realize like, oh, I did that today because of what happened when I was a kid, when this happened. Sometimes we don't know that in that moment, but when we reflect back on things, we see these connections. And I wanted the book to speak about that connection, and then I also wanted the book as a memoir, not to be so individualistic, not just like, oh, this is my personal life, but I'm trying to also trying to grapple with these larger questions of, what does it mean to be a Chinese American, right? In the context of thinking about, for anybody who has, her ancestors from a homeland, thinking about what does it mean being here. So I wanted the book to sort of deal with that too. And that's why I got some of the history.
So the book, it seems like from like talking to you and seeing you at this stage, and when you were writing, you weren't able to like name all these things.
Right.
The book has been very therapeutic for you.
Yeah.
Writing this book.
Right. I mean, some of the things I think I got from therapy, just in terms of seeing things in a different way. I think some things. I think mostly it was just really the writing, the feedback I was getting in the writing, where people are like, "Oh, I don't see your father on the page," or "Where's your sister?" Or, Why are you so passive? What's your role in this? And it just got me. Anytime when you're writing, whether you're writing a memoir or a novel, workshop is going to kick your ass and make you think about things in a different way. So I think all those workshops, paid off.
Okay, I want to thank Dickson for discussing his book with Brown Girl Booklover. I really enjoyed reading this book, and I'm really proud of you.
Thank you.
That you published your book, you won an award, and you're creating your writing path and your journey. And please check out Dickson's book. Thank you so much.